I will ask Bobby Jo Greenland Morgan to start, and that Bobby is the Grand Chief and President of the Gwich'in Tribal Council, and she will be followed by John Jack, and John is the member of Council of Wiyet First Nations, and he has many gadgets I saw on the table, so well, I have one, so very good. And then Dr. Abel Bossum is the Grand Chief Chairman of the Grand Council of the Crees, Iwishi Cree Nation Government. So I want to thank and appreciate you for taking the time to join us, and I will start with Bobby Jo. Thank you. Go ahead.
Masicho, it's great to be here today. Jringwinzi, good day to all. It's a pleasure to be here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. I'd like to thank the Algonquin people for allowing us to meet here this week, and thank you to the conference organizers for hosting this great event. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here and to speak to this diverse audience. My name is Bobby Jo Greenland Morgan, and I'm from the Gwich'in Nation. It is customary in our culture to let you know that I am the daughter of Freddie and Bella Greenland of Aklavik, Northwest Territories. My late grandparents were Robert and Ellen Bruce of Old Crow, Yukon Territory, and Joseph and Bella Greenland of Tetleje, also known as Fort McPherson in the Northwest Territories. My grandmother Ellen told me that when speaking to a group of people, especially when many are strangers, that it's important to let them know who you come from. She said that when you do this, it's important as a form of communication, and also you might find that folks would make a connection to who you are and might know the people that you come from. It's a form of communication, and sometimes you might find a long-lost relative, as I did today. Mr. Dragon and I realized that we were distant relatives, so that's the importance of it. I'm honored to be here today as the current president and Grand Chief of the Gwich'in Tribal Council. The Gwich'in Tribal Council is a land claim organization located in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, and is an organization that represents the rights and interests of the Gwich'in of the Northwest Territories, who are registered participants in the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement, which was signed in 1992. Traditional Gwich'in territory stretches out across parts of Northwest Territories, Yukon, and northeastern Alaska. The Gwich'in have inhabited these lands since time immemorial, and it is the borders that had separated our people, and each Gwich'in region is now subject to a different government and different agreements. Gwich'in and the NWT are signatories to Treaty 11, which was signed in 1921. Many years later, in 1992, our people became signatories to the Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. Both treaties include wording of a seize and surrender clause that continues to this day to be debated and argued. In any case, I truly believe that no government should ever ask an Indigenous group of people to seize and surrender what is their inherent right. Thank you. Such is the case, though, and however, as young leadership today, this is what we inherited, and we're living with it, but we're also working with it and seeing how we can make improvements and make things better. I was only 15 years old at the time our land claim agreement was signed, so I wasn't even old enough to exercise a vote to say whether or not I was in favor of it. But here I am today, trying to do my part in continuing on with the work and to see that this agreement is implemented and progress is made for our people. I am honored to work alongside the Vice President, Jordan Peterson, who is the youngest ever elected to the Tribal Council Executive. When we were elected in 2016, he was only 29, and at the time of the land claim signing, he was only 5 years old. I often tease him and say he weren't even old enough to be home alone. And here he is now at his age in this very important job. We are here today as a younger generation of leaders. We are optimistic that we will help to bring the vision of our past leaders and our ancestors to the forefront. We know that they all wanted what was best for our people, and sometimes they were challenged with different obstacles and different governments than what we are dealing with today. But we know that they've always wanted what's best for the children. In order to do so, we must have the mutual understanding and the cooperation of the Government of Canada and the Government of the Northwest Territories. As signatories to the claim, we need to see continued progress on their part in meeting all the obligations and the spirit and the intent of the modern treaty. We need to have consistencies in the overturns from government to government and folks in key positions that have clear understanding of what the historic treaty meant and what the modern treaty means today. If you take the issue of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, for example, this continues to be a priority to the Gwich'in. We want to see permanent protection of the coastal plain in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is located in the Alaska. The main birthing grounds of the caribou are on the coastal plain, which currently the United States government is doing everything in their power to open up to development. We need parties to our agreements to stand with us and to honor the spirit and intent and to help us achieve protection of this calving ground. We have the Canadian Constitution, Section 35, which speaks to the affirmation and recognition of Aboriginal rights. Aboriginal rights being any activity that is traditional and it makes a culture distinct. So for the case of the Gwich'in, it would be our relationship with the caribou. So to me, it's a Government of Canada constitutional promise to protect and conserve our way of life, and we welcome the Government of Canada to do so. We also have our land claim agreement that speaks to wildlife conservation, promotion and preservation of our culture. We have the International Porcupine Caribou Herd Agreement. This is an agreement between both the United States government and the Canadian government. And they have obligations in there to manage and conserve this herd that migrates back and forth between the borders of both countries. If these agreements aren't implemented, then they are no more than just words on paper. If we can't do that, it's a problem, a big problem. I believe as a younger generation, we are sometimes beyond frustrated that we have to keep fighting the government to protect our Indigenous rights and our human rights. We have already lost a lot as a result of government-imposed policies and legislation that was imposed on our people over the years. We need to work at reviving and regaining our language, among other huge pieces that make up our identity. Now we are in this fight of our lives, just trying to prevent the disruption to a healthy caribou herd. And being caribou people, this is what we rely on. It's the source and the foundation of who we are. And we want more than ever to protect and preserve it. So the implementation of all these agreements that I mentioned would help us to achieve this. That's an example of why implementation is so important. I'd like to recognize the Gwich'in Tribal Council Vice President Jordan, who's here in the audience. I'd also like to recognize the Inuvik Chief Band, Indianak Band Chief Lawrence Nyendo, who's in the audience, and all the staff who are here from the Gwich'in Tribal Council, also Gwich'in Renewable Resource Board, and representation from Vantat Gwich'in First Nation. I recognize them because modern treaty implementation is a challenge, and we see the best results when we can work together, communicate together, and make joint efforts, and we are all involved as Gwich'in people. So as the claim was signed by three parties, the Gwich'in, territorial government, and the federal government. I often compare land claims like that of a marriage. Once the deal is signed and the celebrations are over, things get mighty real, and it takes a lot of hard work to make it happen. It takes solid communication, mutual respect, trust, understanding, agreeing to disagree. It takes a lot of work in order to make progress. With land claim agreements, however, divorce would never be an option. But if it were, I truly believe that as descendants of one of the first peoples of this country, that if we were to vote to divorce, that we get to keep the house. And in this case, the house is our land. Then the government of Canada would have to move out, and they could take the territorial government with them because that's like the offspring. And they can live over there. But of course, we're not going there. We don't want to go there. We want to work together. We want to make joint efforts. We want to implement that agreement that our people had faith in the government to do so. So we would like to continue to move forward in that direction. If we can all do our part and honor our obligations, then we will see true implementation, progress, and there'd be less trouble in paradise. We need to remind ourselves of the positive things, as well as the successes that came after our land claim agreement. One of that is the co-management boards that were established. Yesterday, you heard from the executive director of the Gwich'in Renewable Resource Board. She did a wonderful presentation. We also have the Gwich'in Land and Water Board. There is also the creation of the designated Gwich'in organizations in each of the 4 communities. This sometimes can be a challenge to a land claim organization because we also have the Indian Act bands, chief and councils in our communities as well. But there we go again with our responsibility to collaborate as people and work together, because at the end of the day, we are trying to improve the lives of our people. The Indian Act bans were there since the government of Canada sent the Indian agent in and imposed the Indian Act ban upon our people. We all want what's best, and we see benefits and successes from the claim, but we also see a lot of challenge. We haven't seen any major changes that is still greatly needed to see the quality of life of our people improve. This is something that we know was the vision of our ancestors and something that we need to work on daily to ensure that it's achieved. Sometimes the implementation committee that we work with is slow to see things move forward. Sometimes things that are urgent to us aren't looked at urgent to them. We need to see changes in that. A huge part in a way forward is with reconciliation. We all have a responsibility to see this happen in Canada. I'd like to make mention of the incredible work that was led by the late Gord Downey in raising awareness to the history of residential school in Canada. To raise awareness is necessary in order for the average Canadian to understand and accept what had happened in this country. It was in this very room in December of 2016 that I had the honor to stand with hundreds of other Indigenous leaders as we stood and we watched as the Prime Minister of Canada, the AFN leaders, stood with Mr. Downey, and the elders and the leadership honored him for his contributions. It is very powerful, and I seen that as a very true act of reconciliation, and I believe that it's progress and that we will continue to see more. Recently, I was in Alaska with our Gwich'in relatives, and one of the traditional chiefs by the name of Steve Guinness, he shared something that I'd like to now share with you. He told us that in his years of leadership, he had come to define leadership in 10 points. He said that as a leader, we should all demonstrate these points. 1, abide by your traditional values. 2, inspire and encourage others. 3, be positive. 4, empower others. 5, be decisive. 6, treat all people with respect. 7, be open-minded. 8, communicate. 9, be accountable. And 10, above all, be humble. I'd like to, in closing, I'd just like to ask everyone to think about those points. I believe that if we each live each day to the best of our ability and try to apply these points into our lives and in our jobs that we do, that this would be our direction, our guidance to make continue to make those steps forward as a people and as a country. It will help us towards reconciliation. And at the end of the day, it's all about improving the well-being of our people, the well-being and prosperity of a modern treaty holder. To date, there has been so many broken promises. But we can't change the past. We can only look forward and try to change the future. There is much room for improvement, but we all have a role to make sure that that happens. On a positive note, I'm sure we can all say that we have seen progress, especially in this current government, in regards to Indigenous peoples. I'd like to, one more person I'd like to point out before I sign off here is my 8-year-old daughter who's sitting back there. Hi, Alicia. She's my motivator, like all youth, and in all our jobs. I think we all must always remember that what we do today impacts their future, and that all our decisions should never ever be selfish decisions, but decisions that are long-term. Because like anyone, we want to leave what the best we can for our children. And I think that as young leaders, we need to set that example. We need to be role models. We need to live by example, lead by example, because we don't want to end up like broken promises of treaties and just saying things and it's just on paper and we're not actually living up to it. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for being here today. Masicho for your time, for listening to what I have to say. May the Creator bless you all in your work and safe travels. Masicho.
Hello, everyone. Oh, great. It is up. So my name is John Jack. I'm an elected councillor with the Hawaiian First Nations. We're located on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and we're part of the Monmouth Treaty. Before I begin in earnest, I'd like to acknowledge a few things. First of all, that we're doing our business today on Algonquin territory, and to acknowledge and appreciate that fact. But also to bring greetings from my head hereditary chief, my Ta'i Hawit, Clishan, Derek Peters, who may in fact be here today, but if I don't see him, but if not, he'd like to extend his greetings. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of our Monmouth cousins and friends and co-workers and colleagues, President Les Dorn from the Ukluflaat First Nation, as well as Peter Hansen and Frank Dragon from the Cayuga Checklisset. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge that we do have the Honorable Romeo Saganash here, and I'd like to thank him personally for taking time out of his day to be here. I do have a lot of gadgets, but I did make sure that I left them at the table, although now I kind of wish I could take a selfie. I'm a bit nervous, but one thing I can direct you to is the image that we have in our splash page for all of our presentations is in a place called Keegan, which is it's a national historic site, but more importantly, it's the ancient capital of the House of Upwinnesset, my head hereditary chief's lands. It served as a political center, a cultural center, as well as, especially that rock on the left, served as kind of a military bastion and a site of justice because it's called Execution Rock. We take great pains to bring our lawyers out to take a look at Execution Rock every once in a while, just to let them know what the stakes are. So when you look at New Chawnoth, which is the west coast of Vancouver Island, that's the culture group we're a part of, you see Ot, or something like that at the end of every word. And Ot means people. So you have Moachot. Moach means deer, people of the deer. I don't know what Kayukat means, but Ho'et, Ho'ai, means come back or came back. We're the people who came back. And the reason why we call ourselves that is because we're kind of an alliance of smaller tribes put together who were attacked in the past, before contact, by some nations from the south in like the Olympic Peninsula. We came back and recovered our territory, and we've come back from famine, from disease, and from colonization. And part of the story that I'd like to share is our story, but also how I see that this serves as an example for a possible way for nations under self-government and with treaty to move ahead into the future. Our community has roughly 730 citizens, and we're highly dispersed because for economic reasons. Only about 15% of our people live in our traditional territory, or our ha'hofle. And the other 85% left over a period of roughly 2 generations, which corresponds directly to residential school experiences in the 60s scoop, but also for principally economic reasons. Forestry, fisheries kind of went down. I stole this image from Wikipedia, which is why you see German in the upper left. However, it is one of the nicest photos I have, and it gives it context. Now, those of you in the federal area will recognize this. I grabbed this directly from the PDF of our treaty. This is a photo of our treaty settlement lands, and what it really kind of describes is that our traditional territory is more than this. However, our treaty lands means that we have direct ownership and control, things that you should be well aware of, but for completion's sake, that's why it's there. I want to kind of speak to the whole idea of the incentives provided by self-government. When we get into treaty and when we're responsible for the things that we're doing, it's for a lot of reasons, but it also changes one's outlook on what to do next and why to do it. It provides the tools necessary for us to kind of pursue our own destiny, to do the things we want to do in the way we want to do them. And that's important, because to do anything that we want, we have to have the resources to do so. So we got into treaty for resource reasons, for economic reasons. In the times of colonization, we saw a lot of wealth being taken off of our land, and we didn't benefit from it. In fact, we've taken this to court, as well as talked about this in treaty negotiations, and we've been successful in regaining access to those resources. We need the tools that we have, but we also need more resources, more tools to do the things we want to do to make our lives better. And it's not just to protect what little we have left, but to use all those tools, modern and traditional, to take risks as we see fit to come back. The people who came back. To come back and become what we should have been. Not what we are now, and not what we were necessarily, but something better. And we need to kind of understand that we live with the legacy of those two worlds. One pre-contact traditional world that is almost lost to us, but also that modern, complicated context of not just colonization, but industrialization, of the information age and everything that comes with it, that mixed bag, and make our way into the future. This is our government structure. I won't go into it in too much detail, but what I will say is that we have elected representatives, we have direct involvement of our hereditary leadership in our council, as well as direct democracy through our people's assemblies, which are like our annual meetings, but are conducted a bit differently than how it is under the Indian Act. We have a judicial branch, so to speak, called our tribunal, which ensures that the things that we do as a government are held accountable to the people, but more importantly to our Constitution. We also have arm's-length professional administration, because this is one of the key foundations to a stable government, in that whenever there is a complete change in government, there isn't necessarily a clean sweep of the office. And of course, we have committees, and they're useful, but they're also committees, so I won't go into them. We focus a lot at Huu-ay-aht in terms of economic development. We see economic development as one of the key factors that drove us towards making the decision to support and pursue treaty and self-government, to be able to be active in the economy in such a way that will allow us to find those resources and opportunities to do the things we want to do. We have an arm's length operation where political people like me don't decide who gets hired and fired or how businesses are being run, because that's messy and that's not efficient. But we do have government involvement in strategic direction. And that means that, we can decide whether or not we want to get into having a casino or doing this or doing that. And that provides enough of that kind of community oversight to make sure that our businesses don't run roughshod over our fledgling community. We're not afraid of own source revenue. In fact, self-reliance is one of the things that we're pursuing in earnest. And in fact, when we are no longer reliant on federal funding, we plan to hold a party and invite the feds and say, we don't need your money anymore, because that's what we should be doing. That's self-reliance, that's independence. That's why we're here as a modern treaty nation. When I talk about economic development, I don't mean that it's economic development without our own values. So in business circles, they talk about triple sustainability, not just economic sustainability, where a business makes money in order to justify its existence, but also environmental sustainability and social sustainability. That social sustainability is at the core of why we do things and how we do things the way we do. In fact, the idea that we pursue is that not that First Nations are necessarily against economic development projects or resource development projects, they're against not being involved from the very beginning. And that's how we're trying to demonstrate doing these things from the very beginning. When we talk about the way forward for Hawaiiat, and I think for anyone in a self-governing or modern treaty context, what the treaty ultimately gives you is the impetus to create new relationships or form new relationships in a way that kind of replaces the old baggage. And that's very important. Choosing treaties is choosing an active relationship with a focus on common interests and constructive methods. It's not necessarily an adversarial relationship with anything or everything, but rather it's choosing to talk and to work together to make things better. Disagreement, of course, but not necessarily in such a way that sets either group on their back foot. When you choose treaty, you take a chance on reconciliation, and it's living reconciliation. We talk about that a lot, but really what reconciliation for me and for Hawaiiat is that it's living a new relationship. It's understanding that having a treaty, having a self-government agreement isn't a divorce, but rather an entirely new relationship, one that is active and reciprocal and interconnected and interdependent. It's one where we not just focus on how to redress grievances, but how to forgive grievances as well, because that's how a relationship works. That seems to be how it works in my marriage. When I do something wrong, I need to ensure that I do something that's right. But in order for it to work, I need to be forgiven too. And I'm working at that. You can check with my wife to see how I'm doing, but I'm still married. I think the best practices in these relationships, especially when it comes to Crown relationships, is understanding that the best practice is to seek common interests as well. To understand not just to communicate what we want or demand or need, certainly we should do that, but also to try to understand where the Crown, whether it be the federal government, a department, a provincial or territorial government, are coming from, to really understand those interests. It's a give and take as well. So we need to do what we can to understand the federal provincial context. But not just the federal or provincial context, to understand the wider context, especially when it comes to economics, which is one of my personal focuses and one of the focuses of our nation, is to understand that success economically is often hinging on the fact that you need to be competitive globally, which means that you need to find those ways to work together to create competitive edges across entire nations or provinces when it comes to forestry, when it comes to energy, when it comes to trade. It's a Canadian canoe. And even then, Canada relies on other nations to stay afloat because that's how the globalized world works. We have to understand that we're a part of that. We chose treaty, and as a result, we chose to be a part of Canada, and we chose to be a part of Confederation. And as a result of that, we need to understand what all of those things mean and what we can do to contribute to those things, as well as get what we see we are due, because we can actively pursue and help with that. It's not just Crown governments, however. It's not just the senior governments. It's also relating to our local government partnerships. As a part of the Monmouth Treaty, each member nation was accorded a full voting seat within a regional district, which in BC is an alliance of municipalities and smaller unincorporated communities. It's a lot like a county in Ontario, and I only know about Ontario, so I couldn't tell you about the other provinces in Canada. We joined in April 2012, and we've been full voting participants in local government, to the point where I actually put my name forward to be the chair of the regional district and was voted in December 2016. And I was reelected recently to become the chair. So part of what First Nations can contribute, not only provincially, federally, but locally, is the value of our leadership and knowledge of the lands that we occupied for thousands of years. And it's a good opportunity to create new relationships because many First Nations don't have those relationships with local government, or they're really poor. Treaty provides the impetus to make that a better arrangement. And finally, we do have business relationships that we look at as well, because businesses often have most of the connections internationally. This is a photo of the Huu-ay-aht team, our elected government, and our hereditary leaders, and our administration, openly working with an energy company in regards to the development of an LNG facility on our lands. Now, whether or not you agree with LNG or hydrocarbons in general, that's not my point. I mean, we can have a whole forum about that. But the demonstration here is that Huu-ay-aht has been working to forge relationships and create a reputation by demonstrating professionalism, openness, neutrality, and earnestness in finding those common interests and opportunities, because we have to make up that economic gap. Now, we do so by being open, but also insisting on being equal partners. And the relationship that we have with Steelhead, the relationship that we could have with a port authority or other types of business ideas, those are the types of things that we want to get out and demonstrate, because maybe LNG isn't the option for us or any other nation here. But demonstrating your capacity, your willingness, and your professionalism, that will increase the opportunities you can make, and relationships are at the heart of that. I think lastly, I'll conclude with something a bit more personal to give it all a context. Why Huu-ay-aht does the things that we do. We're very focused not just on bridging the past with the present, but also looking to the future. So this is a photo of my great-grandparents. So these are Jackson Jack and his wife, Maggie Jack. And the reason why this is important is because this set of photos dates when it was taken. This was taken around 1930. And the reason why is because that's my grandfather, at about age 3 or 4. He was born in 1927, which means that these photos were taken about 1930. And he passed away recently, a couple of years ago, or a year and a bit ago. But the reason why this set of photos matters is because this is a woman named Kakacha, my grandfather's grandmother. So she was 108 years old when she passed away in the 1930s. So she's very close. Yeah, that's perfect. She's very close to the end of her life here. But that means that she was raised in the 1840s, 1850s. That means that she was raised traditionally under a self-governing Huu-ay-aht. And that's important to me because this is my granddaughter with my grandfather. So she's 2 now, but my grandfather got to meet my granddaughter. But my daughter, in my small family, is going to be the first woman of my family in 6 generations to be raised in a self-governing Huu-ay-aht nation with our own culture, with our own government, with our own destiny. And I named her partially after Kakacha because of that connection. And that's the hope of the future. That's the reason why I get out of bed. That's the reason why all of us at Huu-ay-aht do what we do, and I understand probably all of you as well. All of you here contributed to that. All of you, federal, provincial, First Nation. And I thank you for it. And, thank you.
Oje, nui naskuma ni chiska jisagat, naskuma tsamendo, jin hibita jiji danot, jim hidagats jisagat. First, let me acknowledge the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation, and in particular the territory of Gitxsan-Sibi, whose ancestral lands we are gathered today. Miigwech. I also want to acknowledge some people in the crowd here. We have with us some of the commissioners from the Cree-Niskapi Commission. They were here listening. Of course, we also have our MP, Romeo Saginash. Thank you very much. And our negotiator for what we call the EU/Indigenous Peoples Relations, Tina Parabano. I represent about 18,000 people in USG, and so I'm accountable to those people, and so I need to be careful of what I say. So I do have a presentation which I will follow. I will follow my script, because you can get into trouble if you don't follow your script, as we know. So Wajia, good day. Oh yeah, I should also say that we also have our legal counsel here, and there's probably a whole bunch of other lawyers here, so that's another reason why I need to stay on my script. I wish to thank the organizers at the Land Claims Agreement Coalition for this opportunity to exchange on this very important theme of modern treaties, successes, challenges, and opportunities for reconciliation. The Grand Council of the Cree was a founding member of the coalition in 2003, and we've been pleased to contribute to the coalition's work since then. I'm deeply honored by the invitation extended to me to share some of the experiences of my people, the Cree of USG, we say the EU of USG, on overcoming challenges to advance the implementation of our agreements and bringing home the benefits promised by the federal and provincial governments. It has now been just 40 years since we Cree signed Canada's first comprehensive land claim agreement, the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. Since then, the Cree Nation has been on a path that has taken us from a point in history where the notion of Aboriginal rights had very little meaning to the situation in which we find ourselves today. Today, the Cree Nation has forged nation-to-nation relationships with the federal and provincial governments. We have dramatically improved the standard of living for our communities, and we play an important role in the governance and economic development of a vast portion of our traditional territory. We have worked hard over the past 40 years to put all the necessary building blocks in place to engage in a true Indigenous nation building. Since 1977, we have gradually and incrementally arrived at the point where we are at the brink of becoming a major economic and political force in USG, our traditional territory, in an area covering over 400,000 square kilometers, 2/3 the size of France. Located mainly in the northern Quebec, USG includes lands on the east shore of James Bay and southeastern Hudson Bay, as well as the lakes and rivers that drain into them. Like for all Indigenous peoples, our culture, our values, and our philosophies, our social organizations, all the rich elements of our traditional way of life are intimately tied to our fundamental connection to the land. It is our connection to the land that has defined us, sustained us, guided us, even to the extent of very dramatic changes that have affected us. The Cree Nation's commitment and struggle to protect our land, our rights, and to ensure their recognition has been in absolute contradiction to the direction of historic Canadian policies and practices towards Indigenous people. These policies have had as their objective to sever our ties to the land and its natural resources, and to undermine our legal claim and our legal title to the land. The Indian Residential School, the imposition of the Indian Act, the creation of the reserve system, the failure to provide for decent basic living standards that are comparable to other Canadians are just some of few examples of this historic colonial stance that we've had to struggle against. Our experience in EUSG has been a variation of the same theme that Indigenous peoples throughout the world have had to struggle with, namely the struggle to protect the way of life that requires being in harmony with the environment and being sensitive to the animals, the plants, and the trees, and all the other living things, versus a system that is guided by unrestrained exploitation of natural resources for monetary gain. I'd like to share with you a very brief history of our people over the last 40-plus years, just to give you an idea how we, in our small part of the world, have dealt with these layers of contradictions and with these multiple challenges. In the early 1970s, the province of Quebec announced its plan to build what at that time was the largest hydroelectric project in the world. Even though it was built entirely upon our traditional territory and would flood vast portions of this land, this project was announced without consulting us, without obtaining our consent. We were considered to be in the way, and Quebec together with Canada believed that we could present no legal impediment to the development initiatives. We were told that we were squatters, without any rights to the land where we had lived since time immemorial. The Cree Nation refused to accept this premises. We took legal action, seeking injunction to stop the James Bay hydroelectric project from going forward. In a surprisingly progressive decision at the time, the Quebec Superior Court granted our injunction. The court found that the damages that we would suffer if the project were permitted to continue would cause serious harms to our culture and way of life, and that could not be adequately compensated. A week later, however, the Court of Appeal suspended this decision, allowing the project to continue. But the legal proceeding forced Quebec and Canada to negotiate with us on ways to mitigate the environmental damage caused by the project, to compensate us for our losses, and to create a framework for future development in the territory. The result was the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, signed in 1975. This is, in fact, our treaty and the first modern treaty in Canada. The James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, as we referred to it, was more than just a compensatory contract. It went much further thanks to the vision of our leaders at the time. The JBNQA established a number of key elements that would set us on a path of nation building, including partnership between the Cree Nation and the province of Quebec in future development of the territory, a system of self-governance for our communities and for our nation, involving local administration, health and social services, education, policing, justice, and a regime of for environmental and social protection to ensure that, among other things, the prevention and mediation of social and environmental impacts of future development projects, the protection of our traditional way of life, and support to realize our community and economic potential. But when the dams had been built and it came time to actually implement the agreement, both the federal and provincial agreements reneged on the important provisions. Commitments were not fulfilled, promises were not kept, and the initial spirit and vision of that agreement that we had fought so hard for was soon forgotten and often outright denied. Frequently, when governments suggested that they might be prepared to implement portions of our agreement. For example, by finally building an adequate fire station or a community center, they insisted that we would have to relinquish the perpetual treaty obligation in order to obtain one-time delivery of that promise. Over the course of the next 2.5 decades, we initiated numerous lengthy and costly legal actions and led public campaigns to redress these failures. We also strongly opposed future hydroelectric projects in our territory. These projects were once again proposed without our consent and our involvement. There were additional and very other difficult challenges that emerged when a pro-independence government in Quebec attempted in the mid-1990s to secede from Canada. Quebec believed that if it seceded from Canada, our traditional lands would automatically remain in Quebec. Once again, we were not consulted. We mounted a major challenge in Quebec's secession claim. We even held our own referendum in which over 96% of our people who participated voted no, affirming that we did not consent to the government of Quebec separating the James Bay Cree and the territory from Canada. We held the view that as peoples under the international law, we retain our right to self-determination. We would not be passed back and forth like pieces of furniture between various governments or federal jurisdictions without our consent. After years of struggle, legal battles, public campaigns in which we fought for our rights as people and advocated for our rights to govern ourselves, eventually both Quebec and Canada came to understand that we were serious about our rights and that we would challenge any initiative which would not respect or acknowledge our rights. In 2002, we signed the historic Paix des Braves with Quebec, and in 2008, we signed a new relationship with Canada. These two nation-to-nation agreements enabled us to reestablish, rebuild our relationship with each government on a new and more equitable footing. The historic Paix des Braves, or Peace of the Brave, provided the mechanism for Quebec to meet a number of its unfulfilled obligations under the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. It transferred responsibility of implementing these obligations from Quebec to the Cree, together with the financial resources to carry them up for a period of 50 years. This agreement also focused on socio-economic development. It recognized and affirmed that certain development projects taking place on our traditional land required our explicit consent and our involvement. This requirement of Cree consent has now become mainstream for all economic development projects within the OSG. We also now receive an annual payment based on total value of all mineral, energy, mines, and forest resources extracted from the territory. The new relationship agreement of 2008 with Canada had at its purpose to transfer substantial federal responsibilities under the James Bay Agreement to the Cree government, along with the financial resources to carry them out. With these agreements in place with both levels of government, we have now begun, in a very tangible way, what it means to have a nation-to-nation relationship. Simply put, these agreements affirm our authority to govern ourselves and our affairs, and our entitlement to provide meaningful guidelines for any economic development activity taking place in our territory. In July 2012, we signed an historic governance agreement with Quebec. In this agreement, the Cree Nation government has assumed responsibility for land use planning process, resource management functions, and municipal management over a territory approximately 70,000 square kilometers. At the same time, a new regional government was created, which exercises municipal management and land use planning powers over a territory of approximately 300,000 square kilometers. This new regional government is comprised of equal numbers of representatives of the Cree communities, as well as the non-native municipalities in the region. After an initial orientation period, the representation will be based on demographic realities and democratic principles. We have also just concluded a governance agreement with Canada, whereby we now will fashion our own constitution, put in place our own laws regarding local and regional governance on Category 1 land, and put in place mechanisms for the enforcement of our own laws. We will not be answerable to any paternalistic, distant government. We will now form our own government on our lands. Since the signing of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975, the leadership of the Cree Nation has been committed to moving our people towards greater expression of nationhood. Our recent history over the past 40 years has been all about a unique kind of nation building, which has been based on our insistence on the acknowledgement and the respect of Cree rights, our Indigenous rights, and our human rights. What this means for us is that we have been on a mission to reproduce our original sovereignty as a nation to the greatest degree possible within the contemporary context. We strive to incrementally and progressively put into place all the necessary tools for our nation, our communities, and our people to thrive in health and security. We've been laying the foundation for long-term sustainability for our young Indigenous nation. We have put in place a mechanism by which we will once again become masters in our own homeland. Our experience in northern Quebec demonstrates one way, one path for achieving concrete recognition of Indigenous rights. The progress we have made has been because we have consistently placed our rights at the foundation of our struggles, our negotiations, and our agreements. We have remained alert to opportunities to exercise our rights, to advocate for our rights, and to protect our rights, and to give tangible expression of our rights. The issues we have faced in northern Quebec, the struggles we have gone through for 40 years, have resulted in a major change in our relationship with the state. In this revolution that we have carried out, we have put into place key elements of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the major recommendations of Canada's report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. We believe, however, that our experience represents an important model for restructuring the relationship between Indigenous people, the state. We have put our people at the center of resource development and in the center of governance realities in a huge portion of northern Quebec, and the sky has not fallen. We believe that it is possible to structure new relationships that can reconcile the role of the state and the rights of Indigenous people. Over the past 40 years, the Cree Nation have been instrumental in international efforts to secure recognition of rights of the Indigenous people, including the adoption of the Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous People, which Romeo played an important role in. We are now working together with other Indigenous leaders and groups in Canada to take this to the next level by urging Canada to seriously implement the Declaration at the national level. Although Canada has officially endorsed the UN Declaration, we are urging Canada to adopt a legislation framework for its implementation. By having a legislation framework which not only acknowledges the Declaration, but it puts into place a mechanism for its ongoing life with respect to Canada's laws and practices, we will be ensuring that it cannot be undone by future governments. This is now our priority, our work on the international issues, an effort in which, if successful, we will set another standard, and a benchmark for states around the world to follow, and which we are hopeful could result in the progress for Indigenous brothers and sisters in Canada around the world. We Cree believe that we have, as a result of our struggles, established a way forward that we believe can serve as model for restructuring the relationship with Indigenous peoples and the state. We have come to understand also that we have now an obligation to share our experience with others if it can help to alter the paradigm and the shift of the thinking about what is possible. In a spirit of solidarity, please know, fellow coalition members, Modern Treaty signatories, that your struggle is our struggle. We stand ready to continue to contribute in the important work of the coalition and its members to ensure that all modern treaties are implemented fully so that they fulfill their promises, providing a foundation for reconciliation and self-determination. Miigwech.